Good evening, everybody. I'm sorry that we didn't have an English here before Purim, so I'm trying to make up for it. At least we can use it for next Purim. We also did not have our review in English on Parshas Tezaveh. And because of the intense contemporary relevance of the entire, which is really a very interrelated issue, the most neglected elements, I believe, in our time, is the relevance of the Beis HaMikdash. Surprisingly, nobody could care less. And I mean, the entire focus of Geula is not on the Beis HaMikdash itself at all. The unbelievable degradation of the concept of Purim and the nature of its achievement, even though it's supposed to be the central achievement prior to Geula of Yisrael, and in fact created our vision of the second Beis HaMikdash and ultimately our commitment to the third. So it's no surprise that the two would be interrelated. The moment that people don't care about one, they're not going to care about the other. And I think the deeper ignorance, and that's probably the underlying cause of both, is the concern for Milchemet Amalek. So Milchemet Amalek is viewed as some kind of, strange kind of primitive and backward-looking racial war, genocidal war. And the truth is that Milchemet Amalek, as the Torah makes very clear, completely changes the relationship both to Kabbalah Satira and to the Beis HaMikdash. This is very simply because of the Shalosh Mitzvahs, the Tezaveh Yisrael, B'Knisas Ha'La'aretz, which requires us to have a Milchemet Amalek before we're capable of building a Beis HaMikdash. And so this happens in the time of David. And this was the entire problem of the attempt to destroy Amalek at the time of Shaul, which would have led to the Binyan, which instead undermined everything about that Binyan. It created all of the horrific problems that it did in the transference of the Melucha ultimately to David, and the problems of the Hashlama of the Malchus, and therefore the Hashlama of the Beis HaMikdash. And it happened again at the time of Esther, who was there as it was a tikkun of Shaul and what went wrong, which relates very much to this week's Haftarah, of course. And there too, there was a Milchemet Amalek, and there was, following it, all of the Hachana for the Binyan of Beis HaMikdash, which here is the center of the Ad Chatzia Malchus, which is discussed, and it's the beginning of the entire story, the mistake that they made, and the chishuv of when it was that the Beis HaMikdash was supposed to be rebuilt. Both of these things are Nogea Kabbalah Satira as well, because we have Vayisum Yerefidim, we have Midbar Sinai, and the Kibu V'Kiblu, which is the tikkun of what went wrong on that Har Sinai, which at the time culminated in Yom Kippurim, and ultimately culminates in Yom Purim itself, which is, Baalei Kabbalah point out the obvious connection between the two, which does not require much Kabbalah to figure out if you recognize that the most striking aspect of Yom Kippur is its Goral, which does not appear anywhere else in any type of Aveda. It's absolutely astonishing. As the Gemara says, I mean, it's like the opposite of everything that we stand for, right? And therefore, if a shame is Koveya generally, and it's the only way to be a Koveya, and Eina Goral Koveya, as a Koshikein, in a case where even a Goral is Koveya, you think for sure if you call the shame that this is the Seir Hashem and this is the Seir Lazazah, so for sure it's Koveya, right? So Gemara Bespin Raya from a pasuk that's not the case, and that in fact it's only the Goral that's Koveya. The fact that the two Chagim that essentially deal with the Maaseh Egel and with the failures of Maimon Har Sinai, Yom Kippurim, which directly speaks literally about the same korbanos that were supposed to be brought on Yom HaShmini, and we've got the Psukim, Kasher Asa B'Yom Hazeh, Tziva Hashem La'asos, learning out the entire Maseches Yom, and Shivas Yomim, Yom Kippurim, from the Shivas Yomim of the Miluyim, and the mitzvah of Prisha, and the mitzvahs of the Miluyim, the similarity of Miluyim and Porah, and the story of Yom Kippurim every single year. All of that is quite clear. The secondary implications of that day, which were much deeper, which Chazal tell us was essentially until Purim. Those were the secondary implications. Those secondary implications was the fact that, as the Gemara says, there was Mikan Moda Rabali Oraita, and that the failure of Maimed Har Sinai was a failure in the relationship of Bnei Yisrael until Purim to Kabbalah Satira, to the extent that there was literally a Moda that for all intents and purposes could have been written that would have parted us from the Kiyam of Torah, which of course limits the sense of responsibility and therefore the sense of connection to Torah, and which was addressed only at the time of Purim, which is Kulo al Shem HaPur, which is really nuts, right? And that becomes the ultimate Yom Kippurim, in which Kimu v'Kiblu HaYudim and all of those issues of Maimed Har Sinai are addressed, which include, of course, the most obvious aspects that relate them specifically to the issues that went wrong on Har Sinai, which was the Vayechasu et Elohim v'yochlu v'yishtu. The translation of that craziness into the madness of the parties in Achila v'Shtia in Shushan, the whole sense of the avoidance of Shlosha Yomim al Tikshu el Isha, which becomes an insane relationship to sexuality and to women and so on, Purim, which is completely the opposite of Maimed Har Sinai. And the overall sense, as Chazal tell us, of the lack, this is shocking, of the lack of tznius in Maimed Har Sinai, because it was open to everybody, which needed to be mitukan, with the tznius of Esther, which of course strikes us as being insane. I mean, Maimed Har Sinai was like very formal and very right, and everybody was dressed properly, and the story of Esther is entirely sexual madness with rapes and nuttiness and beauty pageants and bringing the queen out naked. I mean, that crazy nuttiness that the Gemara talks about, the difference between the way Goyim celebrate and the way Jews celebrate, and I mean, that should be the Kimu v'Kiblu strikes us very, very strange, until, of course, we remember that the failure on Har Sinai is essentially a failure in the nature of human identity. This is shaking terribly because of your computer. I'll bring this over here. I'll bring it over here, and then you can use this thing. Okay? There. It's fine now. And you realize that, as the Maharal explains, the problem of Maimed Har Sinai is essentially a problem of the failure of Klal Yisrael to tolerate the Kafalei Har Chagigit, which is essentially perceived instead of the perception of the clarity and the wonder of the depth of the relationship of the Zacharti Lachesed Niurayach and so on and so forth, becomes experienced by some element of Yisrael as abuse. The Kadosh Baruch Hu basically is abusing us by showing us a relationship that we cannot refuse, is unbelievably addressed on Purim by actual literal abuse, right? Where Esther is adopted as a baby, as an infant by her uncle, who proceeds to take her as a wife and tells her, shh, don't tell anybody. It's like classic to get thrown into jail for nowadays, you know. And more deeply, the entire basis of the interrelationship over there is literally rape. In other words, the Megillah revolves around Esther being taken by Achashverosh in a government-sanctioned rape fest. And somehow, not only does she come out alive from that, but Kimu v'Kiblu is the result of that. So obviously, it's talking about the issues of Har Sinai in the most fundamental ways. And it's expressed, again, the shock that we have that's called tznius, and it's tznius sha'isa the Esther. And that should be a tikkun for the lack of tznius in the Meluchos HaRishonim, which is expressed in the Mishkan, which then needed to be a makom tzanua, and in the second Meluchos, which nobody was able to share, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't do publicly, and Moshe Rabbeinu had to do, and so on, is also madly expressed in the interrelationship of Yom Kippurim with Maimed Har Sinai in terms of something that makes no sense to us until we get to Purim, remarkably. And that is the wild obsession with sperm, right? So this is the entire Maseches Yoma discusses nothing but this madness of like not letting the Kohen Gadol fall asleep for a minute because you're going to have a wet dream. And why in the world anybody would have a wet dream? You let them sleep for 1 second is just, if you want to create a situation where that would happen, it's the best thing to learn Maseches Yoma, where, the guy's thinking, I can't fall asleep for 1 second. It's night, right? But of course, this is exactly what happens on Har Sinai, where the only thing that the Torah is makbid on, in terms of, we think is Al Tikshur Elisha, is not really Al Tikshur Elisha. It's just, the issue is, we don't want any live sperm cells for some reason. Right? So we even learn out from there the question of how long sperm cells can survive. So we discovered 72 hours from there, which is actually right on target. And amazingly, the idea also.
It's 19 hours.
Sorry, we're in the middle of shir, but you're welcome to listen. And maybe he needs to say something of emergency about his daughter.
Well.
And what is amazing is that the aspect of Purim itself, of course, translates that entire issue, as we've spoken about many, many times, of Keri into Yakar through the strange Yirak Roket of Esther, which becomes a profound insight into the nature of Pur and Mikra, and of course Amalek, which is entirely involved in Asher Korcha. Rashi explains, is not only the simple meaning of Asher Korcha, which is the complete cooling off of the enthusiasm and the love and the involvement that we have in the human condition, but actually is a Lashon Keri itself, a Lashon Tumah itself, and that becomes Asher Karahu here with Mordechai and Haman. He points out, he calls it, as the Gemara says, that this is a Kara and Kara, same Amalek that was there originally, and which ultimately becomes the end of Masechet Yoma, in which we have two completely opposite relationships to Mikra in terms of Keri. One is Aroya Keri B'Yom Kippurim Yidak Al Hashana, and the other is His Muftach Lo Shu Ben Olam Haba, which obviously relates to a profoundly evolving relationship that we have to sexuality and the potential b'chlal for tumah that's associated with Mikra itself, especially when we understand this. As Rashi explains it, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu participates with him in giving him a good time and says, why should this guy be uncomfortable, So normal people, maybe to them, there's a problem in their sexuality. This guy's supposed to not have sex on Yom Kippur. So I'll take care of him. We'll make him happy. Right? So which is the most astounding, complete inversion of every sense that we have of the nature of Mikra Laila and of Tumah and so on. It's just madness. And it's the complete opposite of the Bilam Taina against Mikra, which is, why would HaKadosh Baruch Hu be mistaken with Dvarim Keilu? Be mistaken because he's waiting for the tzaddik, that this tipa will be molded the tzaddik. That's nothing compared to what Rashi is claiming HaKadosh Baruch Hu gets involved in Yom Kippur. It's absolutely unbelievable, right? Okay, so that means that clearly the relationship of Milchemes Amalek to these aspects, which are the two central, they're certainly the two central things in our life, one of which is our relationship to Torah, and the other is our relationship to the Shekhinah, has led to, first of all, an unbelievable sense of entitlement and a complete loss of existential awareness, particularly in the deeper connected societies to Amalek, which is essentially Western civilization in its postmodern state, such that anybody who is part of that world cannot help but become infected with this disease called entitlement, cannot help but be infected with an awful sense of complacency and separation from the universe, becomes extraordinarily cold, and unbelievably and counterintuitively, it becomes obsessed sexually, which is like the last thing that you would think happens when you're living in a postmodern world that supposedly is perfectly at ease, and it turns out they're not at ease with anything. So the sterility, the coldness, becomes a loss of love, and indeed takes any aspect of love that would be associated with sex and turns it into Keri, in which exactly what it was that Bilam is questioning becomes the center of the person's obsessiveness. And that central war, really, of our times, is the question is, what is really the human condition? How does a human being relate to the universe? How do we deal with the fact that we've discovered that it appears that Amalek is right on every level, and that our lives are self-created virtualities in which we cannot trace any real one-to-one connection to something that would be external and would be absolutely true? How exactly we deal with that and how we answer those questions is the process that began with the Milchemes Amalek in the Midbar, with the death of Moshe Rabbeinu that made Haman so happy, such that when in the actual day of Purim turned out to be the getting up of the Shiva for Moshe Rabbeinu, who died on Zayin Ba'adar, it was, wow, that's amazing. I mean, we understand, of course, that Haman was a lot more aware than we are. Supposedly the guy that doesn't know anything about Torah, and it doesn't matter. He was actually very, very deeply aware of these patterns in the world. And supposedly the Amalek that doesn't believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I mean, obviously everything that Haman was talking about, Yeshenim and HaMitzvahs, and now's the time to get them, and the patterns that are there because of the Day Moshe Kvedim, and every last aspect, as the Gemara says, he was entirely correct. And the only thing that he got wrong was that Moshe Rabbeinu was born also on Zion, but it doesn't strike one as being a very deep solution to the Haman problem. So the fact that all of this matters so little to us makes it all the more incumbent on us to be able to get a deeper sense of what is the connection, and that's the connection really into Tezaveh, of Zechor itself. These are obvious connections to Parsha Zachar, because that it's the Zikaron B'nai Yisrael that is the essence of the Kahuna that's described here. And the thing that is definitive of Aaron is the fact that he's able to be Noisei Zikaron B'nai Yisrael al Levi. And, of course, the strange fact that the elements of Tznius and Begodim, which appears so much in the Megillah, to the extent that the remnants of the Megillah goes all the way back to Yosef, in which he gives the Chamesh Chalifot Smalot to Binyamin, which is supposed to be Mordechai Yatzam Lifnei HaMelech. But when we read this, we stop the Megillah in order for everybody to say it as if like we really care about the power suit that he was wearing, it's just unbelievable. And this becomes like Midorei Beres. This is the vision that we had before Purim happened, to the fact that Binyamin will be empowered by Begodim, which clearly relates to this whole tznius, which doesn't sound very tznu to us, but anyway, the tznius of Rachel, the breakdown of tznius of Shaul, and the connectedness all the way back to the beginning of what the relationship between Leah and Rachel was, which is why it's Ish Yemini, Ish Yehudi, and the interconnection between the two. I mean, to ignore something that has these type of roots in Yisrael's history is madness. And so it's very, very important for us. First, let's take these simple connections of Parsha Zachar, because we know that Zechor Asher Asalach Amalek must mean that Zechira per se is the opposite of the essence of Amalek. And we know that that is a very simple thing to understand if we take it on its most partial levels. And that is that the essence of Amalek is the postmodernistic definition of the text is all, which means that whatever type of context we provide is entirely a matter of taste and our own desire to determine things in that fashion, has absolutely no connection to anything at all. And in that sense, Amalek believes that the clothing, and clothing, of course, is the deepest aspect. I mean, even to the point at which we call information the hair, which even today, which is central to the Kahuna, as we see later on, the story of Kerach, the shaving of Aaron, and so on. But the deeper sense, not only of hair, which is information that seems to be based on the nature of reality on some level, but even clothing is the added non-value that nature presents us with and that humanity relates to the world with, in the sense that whatever we see of reality is nothing but a clothing that our brain provides to that reality. That's clear. In other words, what we identify as being there, we know now enough to understand literally isn't there. So all of the imaginations that we clothe, I mean, the fact that we clothe certain atomic reactions with the feeling of wood, and believe that this table is here and it's made out of wood and it's solid and I don't fall through it, because what could be more solid than a piece of wood, despite the fact that there's almost nothing there at all. It's a force field, and I'll give it its texture and I'll give it its color. And all of these things have absolutely no presence in the nature of reality, which means that what I'm looking at is clothing. It's clothing that I imagine, and I view it as being very important. So you have the naked ape, and we put things on him, and now all of a sudden, now he becomes a king. Now he becomes a Kohen Gadol. Now he becomes a power-suited man in the boardroom. And all of this is like very important for naked apes, And so for some reason, this becomes our definition of reality. And that's just a childish element of clothing. The fact that every last aspect of our interpretation of reality is just the way we clothe reality. And therefore, our interpretation on a philosophical level of what it is that we are, what it is that reality consists of, and what our connection is, and so on, is entirely a function of our reading in a clothing of structure to something that doesn't have any structure. It's like in a beautiful mind, you can imagine all of these amazing, all these constellations up there, and they're telling you the nature of reality, and humanity has believed this, for generations. Oh, look at this, and obviously that's it. All of this is just absurd, childish primitivism, and it extends to every last aspect of our lives, so that a Molech literally laughs at the Ma'aseh Ego, right? What could be more childish than the Ma'aseh Ego? We would never come to something like that, and therefore it's the most fundamental attack on the nature of Mishkan. What is this Mishkan? That's really a joke. You take some pretty shiny stones and you buy Manhattan off of God, for the beauty. God likes these pretty golden things, and wow. Oh, look at those cute little stones that the Kohen is wearing. I gotta respond to that. It's so beautiful. It's just like, what are you guys talking about? Aren't you embarrassed? It's nuttiness. And so the fact, in the deepest way, that you take yourself seriously, you read into yourself an actual connection to God, whatever that's supposed to mean. How in the world would you, as a dependent entity on passing phases of virtual realities, have some connection to the nature of being? It makes no sense at all. It's really crazy. It's sad. It's just plain sad, is the way that Amalek views it, And therefore, the stripping down of reality to what Bilam does in terms of, the instant of Bilam, which becomes the Planck second, which becomes the ultimate Kodachrome moment, which we can catch you at anything. And therefore, all of your wonderful chashivas, really wouldn't take much to get the right photographs to put up on YouTube, and you're screwed right forever. So, everybody's got those photographs, Unfortunately, now we know the CIA has been taking pictures of you. Well, fine, if somebody gets hold of this and WikiLeaks puts it up on YouTube, so the fact that everybody's got that photograph doesn't matter, but they got yours. So that's the important thing. So that itself is nonsensical. Just, this is crazy. So therefore, the thing that appears to be most reasonable is the approach of Bilam, is the approach of Alman. It's like, you take advantage as you can of whatever the situation brings you. You certainly don't read all of this amazing importance into it and trace things back to my separation. That's the opposite of the very concept of Zikaron. Zikaron is there to say that each moment and each piece in space-time is related specifically through Mikra in the most incredible ways to strange patterns that appear, which don't seem to have any reason for being there at all. And this becomes now the way in which we trace a reality that we discover is real because it's not only not a question that the nature of reality is created through our clothing of reality, but that there's no reason to believe that there's anything else there at all. In which case, the nature of creation itself is that reality, which gives us the deepest connectedness, the deepest shutafut to the act of creation. And insofar as creation is there and is somehow an expression of sharing the nature of being, then the only thing that's valuable about it is the fact that we clothe it, and that we experience it with that clothing. So it turns out really that in the end, it's only by Dama Shetashiv because the sense of Purim and the celebration of Purim that we end up dealing with Amalek, because there is no answer. There can never be an answer to anything unless the answer is the question. It's always like that. It's like that in the Gemara too. If you have to answer something, so then it's shinuya dechike lo ba'akid. Don't give these kvetchy answers. What's the point of a kvetchy answer? The brilliance of science has always been that the question turns out to be the answer, but only after, like, you kill yourself almost because everything that you once believed was wrong. And the same thing is true, of course, of Amalek. It has to be that the question is the answer, and that this goes back to redefining the paradigm that we have of separations itself. And it's because of this that this is so important, and that the connections to Parsha Zachar are so profound. So before we get to the Parsha Zachar elements, I need to point out to you, as we usually do for a Chumash review, which this also is, even though we're talking about as well, Parsha Zachar, and in the end, Megillas Esther, and that it's redefined by Shushan Purim, which is another piece of Purim that has gotten lost. People think that Shushan Purim is another day of Purim, instead of recognizing that it totally redefines Purim and has nothing in common with the Purim that took place until the day we call Shushan Purim, which we'll get to. But in order to do all of this, I think it's important for us to take a look at the structure of the Chumash itself here and to see what is wrong, so that hopefully we can see what is right. Okay, so let's take a look at the beginning. We start our parshas with V'ata Tezaveh Bnei Yisrael, and you will notice that the Goyish chapters, this is chapter 28, which of course has nothing to do with Yisrael's understanding of the Chumash, and has been put in there by priests and so on, and printers. And so the Goyish understanding is that V'ata Tezaveh is part of chapter 27, and has nothing to do with this, which makes a heck of a lot of sense. You got to admit, because I mean, even if you ask me, what is this parsha about, as opposed to what is the previous parsha about? So they will tell you that this parsha is about the creation of the kahuna, Aaron, and the clothes of the kahuna, and the miluim of the kahuna that brings the kedusha to the kahuna. But that doesn't have anything to do with the closing of the previous parsha, which was talking about Shem and Zayat Zach Katit L'Mahor La'alot Ner Tamid, which is part of the things that you do in the Beis Hamikdash, and that seems to relate to the closing of the previous parsha, which in fact there isn't even a parsha Ptucha between them. So when we get to the Chatzar HaMishkan, after we finish the Chatzar HaMishkan, we talk about lighting up the Mishkan. And it's really interesting because Lamaisa, the Midrashim, see it that way. In other words, we start off with a unoccupied bias, in a sense, and when the lights go on, it's like the Midrash says, when the lights go on, now you know that the Shekhinah is there. I mean, if the lights aren't on, so you need to turn on the lights. So the turning on the lights is the menorah, which is the way that they see it. And now we talked about, okay, that's the next story, which we call the next parsha. But no, it's not that way. We actually start from V'ata Tezaveh. Now, it would make sense that we would start there, even if we want to insist that what we're talking about here is the structure of the kahuna, because it's for the first time that we've spoken about here of something that Aaron uvanav have to do. So we have Mi'ol Moed, Michutz Laparochet, Yaroch Oto Aaron uvanav Mi'erav Ad Boker. Okay. So now I understand. Who is that? Who is Aaron Uvanav? So, okay, now I've begun basically discussing Aaron Uvanav. So I should go back, take back a step. Oh, I forgot to tell you, maybe that should have come first, but whatever, at least the two are interrelated, a little poor editing, and so on. Okay. So we can justify at least the beginning with the mitzvah of the menorah. The problem, as we've spoken about very often, the problem is that not only is it out of order because we don't even have our Lachicha yet, but also in terms of the halacha, something is very strange, because even though it says over here, Yarochat Aaron Avanav, the halacha is that, as the Rambam paskins, a zar can be madlik menorah even lechatchila. Well, even though the Rishonim Taina, how can it be even lechatchila if it says Aaron Avanav? I mean, normally Aaron Avanav would mean only kahuna. If it says Aaron, it's mashing in the Kohen Gadol. We know that it's not a din in the Kohen Gadol, but okay, at least it should be that there needs to be a connection to Aaron. Okay, fine. So there is definitely something strange that's going on right away in the relationship to Aaron Avanav here. When we say we understand that the solution actually lies therein, because, as the Medrash puts it, Moshe Rabbeinu and tells him that, I need to have a coin. So Moshe says, well, could you give me a hint as to which shevet it would be and how I would make the coin Kodesh? So says, yes, I'll tell you, you're going to be using the Shevet HaMishcha, and it's going to be Shevet Levi. Which Moshe says, wow, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Moshe, it's not Shivtecha, it's your brother. Right? It's a very, very strange medrash, but it's actually pointing to something that is very important, as we've seen, which is that the choosing of Aaron here, not only because of the fact that every single time that it mentions him, it's always in terms of Aaron Achicha, instead of why not just, Aaron HaKohen? But because, as the Medrash is pointing out, it can't be about Levi, because Levi hasn't been chosen yet. And we don't get to the choice of Levi until the second month of that next year, when we already have the Mishkan and is finished and so on. And then we have Nasai, and we have the special ceremony of making Levi Kodesh. And as the pasuk in Divrei Hayamim points out, it's a two-pronged process in which Levi is muvdal and uses the lashon havdil, which the Rambam brings, of course, in Halach Lamaisa, in Hilchos Shemitah V'Yovel, and mitoch shevet Levi, so vayibadel Aaron lakdisho kodesh kodashim. There's another that's out of the kedusha of Levi. We have kodesh kodashim of Aaron. Well, if there's no kedusha of Levi, then what the Medrash is doing is making it very clear. This is not about Levi yet. We haven't even introduced the Maisa Egel. It doesn't matter whether chronologically is the Balchokis for showing what happens here. But the fact is that Torah has not yet introduced the Makor of Levi at the Maisa Egel, or has indicated to us yet, which although the first hint appears at the end of this parsha, but certainly not yet, we have a hint that this Mishkan has something to do with the Maisa Egel, which it may or may not, depending on which approach we take, both among the Rishonim and among the Midrashim. But in any event, it's about, as the Medrash points out, it's about Aaron Achicha. In fact, one very beautiful way to view the entire parsha is to understand that through the end of this parsha, Moshe Rabbeinu is as much a Kohen as Aaron is, because as the Gemara says, during the Shivat Yimei HaMilui, Moshe was the one who was actually being Mishamish. So we're wondering, do the clothes relate to Moshe? So, B'ma shimesh Moshe kol Shivat Yimei HaMilui. I mean, Ma'ida Have Hava. But this is important for us to understand, because it's Moshe Rabbeinu's relationship to the Begadim that he's being told to make for Aaron Achicha. So, if he makes the Begadim for himself, then it isn't Takriv Aaron Achicha. So the Gemara says that, well, actually, he was Mishamish B'chaluk Lavan. But the reason that the terminology of Aaron Achicha is so important and how it relates here to Shivyas Yemei HaMiluyim is drastic. Because Aaron Achicha only becomes a Levi because of 7 days of arguments that Moshe gives HaKadosh Baruch Hu, at the end of which, as HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, okay, Aaron Achicha, oh my God, Aaron Achicha Levi, Ani Amarti, Ata Levi, Ata Kohen, V'hu Levi. Okay, now this Aaron Achicha Levi, Hu Yeh Kohen, at the end of the 7 days. Ata Tiyeh Levi, which is exactly what happens over here. Right? So this is that transference, and that's the anger at Moshe Rabbeinu, which is reflected even in the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu's name doesn't appear here, which is Purim, attributes to the fact that he says in next week's parsha, because that's the way we understand its relationship to Ega. But in any event, clearly this has to do with Aaron Achicha specifically, not with Aaron as the Nivchar of Levi for the Kohuna, which would explain why, even though it says Aaron should be Matakit, it doesn't mean that L'Dairos there's a din of a Kohen Gadol, or a din even, as the Rambam says, of Kohuna at all. Okay. Now let's continue. So now we get to the first Ptucha. The first Ptucha describes, really, in many steps, the Bigdei Kohuna. And it turns out there's really only, in a sense, 2 types of Bigdei Kohuna. There's an ephod, and that ephod includes an ephod, and the cheshev ha'ephod, and the choshen of the ephod, and the me'il ha'ephod, and all of those things together, even to the extent that lo yizach ha'choshen me'il ha'ephod becomes one of the Tariq mitzvahs, and is a law of the Eraisa, that defines the essential beged of Aaron HaKohen, and in the course of defining that ephod, it will also be understood that he is going to be nice as Yikar b'nei Yisrael al libay through wearing this version on this ephod. Fine. The next piece that we have is something very important. Wow, I mean it's v'asitat tzitz zahav tahor, right? So okay, that was the other thing. Oh, right, of course. So one of them is the intellectual part, so to speak, because that becomes connected to tefillin. We know that that's connected to tefillin because we learn out the din of tamid al mitzchay, meaning in terms of his awareness that he always has to be aware that he's wearing the shem yud kei vav kei on him. So we make a kavachon to tefillin. In fact, there was a makkah between the tzitz and the mitznefesh shabor shonir, and that's where you could put the tefillin. So he also had tefillin, also had the tzitz, and this becomes the complexity relationship between the Til Tchelet and the Mitznefes and the Katav of Kodesh LaHashem and so on, right? Okay, so this is, wow, one of them is Al Libo, so that's Al Levavecha, and the other one is B'nei Necha. So it's basically the 2 aspects that are Mechaber, that's what it sounds like, 2 aspects that are Mechaber, the intellectual presence of the Kohen Gadol in terms of tzitz, and that becomes, wow, very powerful. You show the tzitz to Bilam and he falls out of the sky, right? And so that becomes the makor of testing purity and so on. And then you've got the zikar b'nei Yisrael al libo. So there you have the responsiveness, the emotive aspect of the Kohen Gadol. There's only one problem with this little neat explanation, and that is that the tzitz appears in the stuma, which closes the begodim, and that stuma is basically about underwear, because it has the things that are similar to, I mean, everything we spoke about at Torah was l'chavoda l'tifaret. The tzitz, which you think is like the ultimate l'chavoda l'tifaret, comes over here l'chasot b'sar erva. It's like the exact opposite, right? As a matter of fact, we lahalacha, I mean, we've gotten used to the idea, but we are very shocked by the halachic concept of the interrelationship of the first begodim to the second begodim, in the sense that we think that l'chasot b'sar erva means from your eyes. Strangely enough, la'alacha l'chasot b'sar erva means from your heart. Right? So if you're wearing a perfectly good robe that covers you completely, but it billows, and therefore doesn't cover your heart from being able to be roya as erva, not I ever noticed any, optical sensors, but for some reason that's no good. Then you're not allowed to be Isaac and Divrei Kedusha and so on and so forth. It was like really strange. You sort of got used to that, whatever it's supposed to mean, but it certainly gives us a completely different sense of the interrelationship of the Begadim al Halev and the Begadim that are Mechas B'Sar Erva. Now that seems to us to be a little bit crazy. I mean, why would you take the thing that shows the essence of the Kahuna? It's supposed to be Kohen Gadol. It's supposed to be on him always, right? How in the world does that go together with the Arba Bigdei Kohen Hedyot, which are really just undershirts, underpants, a yarmulke, a hat? I mean, like, what does that have to do with the tzitz? It's absolutely shocking. Then we realize that the etzim, there are two completely different concepts of Kahuna, as Rashi has explained. So one aspect of Kohen is patrician, as it says, B'nai David Kohanim. Is a concept of nobility that's associated with the Kahuna, which has to do with its kavod v'tifaret aspect. The other aspect of the Kahuna, as Rashi says, Kol Lashon Kohen is a Lashon Misharet, somebody that's doing the dirty work. Right? So, okay, so he's working there. He's the shamash, so to speak. So in terms of the Beis HaMikdash's dirty work, which is in fact done by the Kohanei Hedyot, where the Kohen Gadol can choose to do whatever he likes of that work. But the one thing that he doesn't choose is something much deeper. The thing that he doesn't choose is that he is the one that is machshir Aveda that has become ruined because of Tumah. So that means the Sheirut, he's the one that is the ultimate arbiter of the kashrus of the Sheirut through wearing the tzitzal, right? So that means that the tzitz is really part of the Sheirut of Begadim, not part of the covenant Tiferes Begadim. And therefore it appears together with that aspect of the Kuna, which is Sheirut.
So he's not representing the Kohanim, he's not representing the people.
Correct. Yes, he's Barak and Tum, whatever. But it's, yeah, fine. All right. Then this is followed by the Shivat Yimei Miluim, which is all part of the creation of the Kedusha Sakuna. So, okay, understand. There's the Miluim that are necessary, together with the putting on them the Shaman HaMishcha. And actually, L'Dairais, we know that there's two different aspects in the Kedusha of the Kohen Gadol. One is the Meruba Begadim, and the other is Nimshach Shaman HaMishcha. And interestingly enough, the only difference between them is one thing, is the Mishnah says, Ein bein Meruba Begadim le Nimshach Shaman HaMishcha, except for one thing, and that is the par for kapora of a Kohen Gadol. Now the par of the Kohen Gadol,
Must be sent.
just close it and know what's happening. Happens every year, people write in there. So that is something that has to do with kapara. You'd think we didn't know anything about kapara, and we don't, not at this stage, until we get actually here. For the first time, all of a sudden, we learn that these miluim do have something to do with kapara. So this is parachatata selayom ala kippurim v'chiteta ala mizbeach v'kafrecha. The most striking thing of all, of course, is the ptucha, which is the only other ptucha. And it violates our complete sense of appropriateness of the structure of the parsha, because we thought we had finished the story of the Asiyas HaMishkan in Truma, and now we're dealing with the Kuna and the Misharsim. So as the Rambam actually talks about in the Dinim of the Beis HaMikdash, which he brings, so you have two steps. You have Hilchot Klei HaMikdash ve'Ovdim Bo. So that's the Kelim. And then you have Hilchot Beit HaBechira. Okay, so we thought that that's basically what we're dealing with, right? But no, turns out that's not true at all, because all of a sudden we find out that through apparently horrifying editing, someone forgot to stick in the Mizbach HaKtoret into last week's parish, like we described the whole Mishkan as if we didn't even need a Mizbach HaKtoret, which is really crazy. So, but it's not, you need to understand, it's not just a question of the structure of the parasha versus Truma. It's an incredible literary horror, because it's introduced here as an anticlimactic, nonsensical afterthought in which the parsha has ended with precisely what you would expect if you ignore the last psucha. So, it talks about Lifnei Hashem asher yiva'ed lecha shama, tadaber elecha sham, v'no'adeti shama lifnei Yisrael, v'nikdash b'chvodi, v'kidashti et ha'moed v'et ha'mizbeach, ואת אהרון ואת בניו הקדש לכהן לי, ושכנתי בתוך בני ישראל והייתי להם אלוהים, וידעו כי אני אדוני אלוהיהם, אשר הוצאתי אותם מארץ מצרים לשוכני בתוכם. אני אדוני אלוהיהם. Wow, what an ending! With incredible chidushes, all the Rishonim point out. Did you realize that Yetzias Mitzrayim was the sole purpose of L'Shochni B'Tocham? It's a completely different understanding of what the nature of Ata Kirvanu Hamakom Lavodato and all of this. It says the pasuk. It's the only reason I took you out. As the Ramban explains, Cherut Yetzias Mitzrayim is only achieved with the making of the Mishkan, because the idea is that Yisrael has to be Chazru L'Ma'alot Avotam, which is that they became a Merkava L'Shechina. They become a Merkava L'Shechina with the Asiyas HaMishkan. So now all of a sudden, like, our entire vision of, like, what it meant with the Atem Tiyonis Kulam Yikolam Mim, Mamlechet Kohanim, all of these things, which we thought had to do with mitzvahs, and so now all of a sudden it turns out that making this thing, which is so related, we thought, to the concept of Egel and Chet and primitivism and so on, now it turns out that was the purpose of the entire Tzia. Okay, whatever you want to say, it's certainly an amazing ending to the parsha, right? To find that the next word is V'asita Mizbeach Ketoret is absolutely mad. I mean, it feels horrible when you're reading it. It's so anticlimactic. Like, almost the only thing you get to be that awful is the parsha of Ov and Yedoni. I mean, it's like, which after this incredible ending, oh, by the way, yes. Got to mention. I mean, it's really terrible. And what's even more is, for heaven's sakes, we find out that we don't even know. It's talking about a Yom Kippur that hasn't happened yet. So you understand that the deep relationship of our parsha to the idea of Zachor and the carrying of Zechir, and the interrelationship of Yom Kippurim as it's embedded in the Mizbach Ketoret, which is only possible to discuss now. And the reason that it's only possible to discuss now is an astonishing reason, because as the Rabbi Nubachia points out, yes, the reason that it's discussed now, and the pashtas is that the Mizbach HaKtoret is the kahuna. It's not something that is a kli in the Beis HaMikdash that can be discussed before the kahuna. So you say, okay, because the zer on the Mizbach HaKtoret is the keter kahuna, so what's it possible to discuss a Mizbeach? A Mizbeach is part of the kahuna. The deeper understanding that it implies is that what it means is that we're still in the middle of discussing Asiyas HaMishkan. If we're still in the middle of discussing the Asiyas HaMishkan, then it means that Aaron is part of the Mishkan, not Ovdim Bo. So the difference between Kahuna L'Deres, which could be Ovdim Bo, and the nature of the Aaron, and the difference between the korban of the Hayra, the Kohen Gadol, and why it requires the Shem HaMishkan, is, as Chazal point out, the reason that those two korbanos of the Paralel Davar Shel Tzibur and the par Helen by Chatas of the Kohen Gadol, both are pogea in the Kedushas HaMishkan directly. So this is not talking about something that's done with the Mishkan. It's talking about something that is part of the Kedushas HaMishkan, which completely changes our tfisa of it and leads to the amazing insight of the Rabbeinu Bachya, in which the Rabbeinu Bachya points out that this, I mean, he doesn't explain himself totally, but this is the full explanation of Rabbeinu Bachya. In the same way that you have in my separations, two different narratives of my separations, it strikes you exactly the same way the end of this parsha strikes you. You just finished this tremendous Tezaveh Purim, everything is possible, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu sees Kol Asher Asa, V'nei Tov Ba'od, and wow, it's like we're really at the end of it, right? And all of a sudden you find out, well, we're sort of at the end of it, but actually it turns out that there was no grass. Lama, because I mean, it's exactly as dissonant as this is. You just finished. It's like, you just finished, and now you're telling me let's go back and discuss about it. Says Rabbeinu Bachya, it's exactly the point. Because what happens in my separations is that what we needed to understand that there is a real autopoietic aspect in which the end of my separations is only achievable by going backwards, so to speak, in time and recognizing that human consciousness was part of the actual Asiya, which couldn't have been taken into consideration when I'm trying to give you a step-by-step presentation of my separations, which Adam comes at the end. So I had to pretend, in a sense, that there was a third day when things could grow, but there couldn't be a third day when things could grow if I hadn't already gotten to the sixth day when there was an Adam that had a mind. So in the same way, says Rabbeinu Bachya, that my separations required the presence of consciousness in order to achieve there being an Adam who is makir, so has to be conscious, he has to be miyached, he has to provide an integration to the scattered pieces of what has no reality without that consciousness, which is exactly addressing the elements of Zechira and Amalek. And after doing that, is capable of being Oved. There, so this becomes the Beit Tefillah. So too, the Mishkan was not completed without consciousness. So we know that the interrelationship of the Begadim is directly to, it doesn't even work without awareness, right? And that's the whole story of Chana and Eli, what you're talking about. So I don't take you seriously because your brain isn't working. I mean, you're telling me that you're reading Shikora over here instead of Kishera because you don't know how to read. So, so therefore, Lo Adonata, that's the way the Chazal tell. But that means that the interrelationship with the Kohen was not on the Madrega. We made a Choshen Mishpat, but it didn't work. So it was the aspect of the Urim V'Tumim and the control of the relationship to the Shem Hashem, which is there, the way in which that connects to the awareness of the Kohen Gadol, did not work in the second Beis HaMikdash because there wasn't that Darga of Kahuna. So that means that, says the Rabbeinu Bachya, that yes, indeed, so the closure, therefore, the Mizbach HaKtoret, is the equivalent of the grass in my separations. It cannot appear until after you go back and understand the nature of the presence of consciousness in Hakara and Aveda and an Adam that's Miyachid, and that is Aaron, and now becomes the equivalent of Adam in the story of my separations. And therefore, and then as this Forno points out, there's these other elements. Because of that, the Mizbeach of the Mikvah Keteris is not part of the requirements for V'no'adati V'shachanti. So it's actually a translation of the Mishkan into Yom Kippurim. This is very profound because it interrelates in advance the story of Aaron, Yom Kippur, the Asiyas Ha'ega, which is through Aaron, the interrelationship with the Onan, which is unique to Aaron, all the things that we find out in Achrei Mos, by giving us the Shoresh Inyan up front. But we now understand, but we have a completely different picture of the nature of what it would mean. Now, what's amazing is that the concept of the Aveda of Kahuna and those 7 days that made Aaron the Kohen came from V'racha v'samach b'libo. So because of that, it says, why is he the one that's able to wear the Zikar B'nai Yisrael al libo? Leiv shesamach, since he, and this was the whole point that HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Moshe, you've been playing around with me for 7 days. You never told me the reality. So now you're fessing up. Shlach na b'yad tishlach. There's even a funny medrash that says, so you kept me going for 7 days just because you wanted to have a good conversation, huh? So the real point is that I'm supposed to treat your brother differently. Because after all, it's going to hurt him very deeply. So I'm telling you that the very fact that you think that your brother could be hurt means you can't be a Kohen. Your projection of hurt into Aaron means that Aaron's the only one that can be the Kohen. You can't be a Kohen. And I'm telling you that not only will he not be hurt, but v'racha v'samach b'libo. That v'samach b'libo becomes, as the Medrash says, the lave that was capable of being samech in the achievement of someone else's potential is the only lave that can carry Zikaron B'nai Yisrael. Where is the makar of that simcha in Ma'aser Bereishis? The grass. Yismach Hashem b'ma'asav occurs only with Terem Yitzmach, and then with the Kal V'chomer that the grass figures about itself, that it's supposed to be Teotzila Mineya. Pasach Sara Elam V'amar Yismach Hashem b'ma'asav, and that Yismach Hashem b'ma'asav is the joy at the achievement, the self-achievement of Ma'aser Bereishis, which becomes the mocker of the simcha of Aaron, is the self-achievement of Ma'aser Bereishis. So it's this massive involvement with potential, with the need to see potential realized, that is the deepest joy that he can experience. The uniqueness of potential is so central to him that it's impossible for him to be Mikane. And that is a fantastic exposure of the deeper meaning of the Rabbeinu Bach's opening, which is that with Shemen and Ketoret, Yismach Lev. The opening of the Parsha is Shemen, the closing of the Parsha is Ketoret. These two things together brings the Simchat Lev, Simchat Lev of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Simchat Lev of Aaron, and so on and so forth. It sounds like, well, because, the Shemen is Or, it brought Or to the Elam, and this is the original oil, the Teref Befio, and that was the first sense of hope. And the Ketores is a tremendous source of happiness, whatever. I mean, it sounds very, okay, fine. Relate it. He relates it giving a person who's hungry. You not only give him a good meal, but it's got to smell good. So if you give him fried French fries together with, so then he's like, I mean, it's like, what? What does this have to do with anything? Amazingly, it opens up the deepest door to us about how it is that we have two completely different ways of facing the human condition. Right? So now, the Amalek approach to facing the human condition. Amalek is a basic response to finding yourself as a human being, or even as Adam Arisha. And that's the reason that the Bnei Yisachar points out that the opening to Amalek, which is Ayesh Hashem B'Kebenu Yim Ayin, has to be traced back to Hanachash Hishiani, which is Ayesh Yim Ayin. Because it's basically Adam Arishan's playing with Minus. So that's as the Gemara says, Adam Arishan was a Min. But that Minus touches on Hayeshu Ayin, and it has to. And the reason that it has to is because the moment that you become aware of the absurdity of the human condition, of dreaming of being in a state of what appears to be essential non-being, of absolute dependency, which is the ultimate fiat tova. Because I cannot stand a situation of wanting to be God and having absolutely nothing except what it is that God gives me. And this is basically what the Nachash is saying, right? So the Nachash says, well, you really can't have anything, right? What do you mean we can have anything? No, you can have what God feeds you in the zoo. But that's all that you have. I mean, let's really call a spade, right? Now, this concept of Anocha Shishiani leads to Fiat Tova. There's only two possible responses to the deep awareness of that reality. One of them is to imagine yourself as being capable of living each instant as a separate reality that does not have to be connected to anything else, and therefore strips things down to the pure instant of existence that is there. That is essentially Bilam, which becomes Amalek, and the stripping down, so that the acceptance of the truth becomes a marker of Nevi'as for Bilam, so that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Vayikar, and that becomes the entire contrast of the Nevi'as of Bilam to the Nevi'as of Moshe, and the closing of Kol HaTorah Kula. So, Navi b'Yisrael to Moshe, right, lo kam. But that's only b'Yisrael, but b'umot kam. And this goes together with the Chol HaYad HaChazakah, with the Le'enei Kol Yisrael, which is the Shvirat HaLuchot itself, which is what Bilam makes constant reference to, because of the fact that the Egel is so absurd from the point of view of him. It's all projection. And once you allow yourself projection, the sky's the limit, literally. And that's exactly what happens. The other approach is the exact opposite approach, which is the embedding of total uniqueness of the stripped down moment into the nature of the universe, which is open to an infinity of possibilities and only takes on a reality with the insane expression of an absolute objectivation, an instantiation of that potential, which is exactly what happens here with Aaron. I could not dream of ever being jealous of anyone because of the fact that this instant has nothing to do with me. So in the same way that no one is jealous, as Chazal put it, you're only jealous of someone who's in the same line, right? On the contrary, when it comes to people watching, you think watch the Olympics, and everybody's sitting, I hope she falls, I hope she breaks some eggs, right? Oh, I hope he misses it. Oh, I hope it. And it's exactly the opposite. Oh no, terrible! You cry. Oh, she almost made it. What a tragedy! Like what the? Who cares? What happened to all of the Schadenfreude that you live with all of the rest of your life, right? Because it's totally out of your reach. So it becomes an expression of human potential, which you have nothing but the deepest desire. It's such an intense way. I mean, you stay up all night watching, not because it's so entertaining, but because of the human aspect of it. Wow, a human being can do that? Like, well, it's unbelievable. What did it take to get here? What did she put into that? But one moment. And she's like that one moment, right? And it's worth everything. Okay, so I understand that becomes the exact opposite idea in which there's a complete integration in terms of the Adam that's Makir, of recognizing that this is the universe. It's not, this is my connection. So that it becomes a universal expression of everything that I'm capable of. I should be no jealous of it and attempt to prevent it. What are you, crazy? So those moments in which we share that joy in the experience of human potential, I always talk about Billy Elliot, the movie, being such an amazing expression of that idea, right? So where an entire community gets together And all of the hang-ups, but the whole thing is so sexually hung up. And I thought, whoever heard of a boy who wants to be a dancer, it's crazy. And in the end, the entire thing becomes completely beyond, exactly as Purim itself does, completely beyond any normal sexual considerations, completely open to all types of interrelationship. Why? Because everybody is committed to he's got to succeed. And then everything changes. Wow. So this is Aaron HaKohen all the time. When Aaron HaKohen recognizes a person and speaks to them in terms of what they are capable of, it's like the most unbelievable experience. Because this guy is for real. That's what he sees me as. And that's what Chazal say. If he speaks to you, means somebody can actually see me like that. So then I must be like that on some level. And it's really true. So that brings out whatever that person was capable of. This becomes this immense zikaron and connectedness, which is the opposite to the approach of Amalek. Now, what this means is that what appears to be just this silly description of the interrelationship of the opening of the parsha of Shemet to the end of the parsha of Reah is actually, in the most astonishing way, the posuk that Mordechai says to Esther. This is Reva Vatzala Yamod Yudimi Makom Acher V'at Ubeit Avich Tovet. Why? Because the idea of or opening the parsha is the Makom Acher. Because what that or is the ultimate beged. Because as Chazal tell us, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was Lovesh or Salma. So Oto or Salma, he took that beged, and from that beged he flipped it for a moment, and all of the world comes out of that beged. So that's the deepest sense. Of course it's a beged. It's a beged that you share in the instant of creation. We saw for not so far. It was HaKadosh Baruch Hu's beged, silly. So you call it primitive because you're supposed to be the naked God, and God is supposed to be the naked God. That's like looking at a naked singularity. It doesn't exist. So the only real way to have anything is to make a beged. That's the point. Like the resurrection itself is not a beged. You're sitting here eating about it, and God is silly. Fine. That we're getting a beged or is the potentiality of because every possibility exists there. This was Moshe's vision, which is why he grew in any piece of vision. You can only provide the entire muck of the vision. What is Ketorah? Oh, Ketorah is the only expression in terms of resolution of the one thing that is completely, totally, and absolutely, and inimitably unique. To the point where a dog will know every single one of 9 billion human beings without a chance that he would get one confused with another by a simple smell. So this is with the Shemen and the Reach, Yismach Lev, exactly. Because those two things are the interrelationship of the totality with the absolute uniqueness. You think that's something. I mean, the truth is that any fish can tell the difference between any other fish. I mean, 10 billion humans is a joke. I mean, that's like a school of fish, You're talking about like any fish in the oceans of an entire planet. That's mind-boggling, right? So that is the complete and total recognition of how it is that detail of individuality and of absolutely incomparable and unmistakable and therefore inimitable uniqueness is part of the original or, which is exactly what Mordechai is saying. The fact that Rabbi Vatzala Yamodu Yudimi Makom Acher defines the extent of the universe in which you are working and living, the fact that that may be your moment is so astonishing that this is the instant of your smell. And of course, that's Mordechai's Moridachia, which is compared to the Rosh Besamim, which is that's the Moridachia itself. Right?
The Hadas as well. Is also
Yeah, but the Hadas is related to not in terms of its smell, but rather in terms of its sneeze, as we'll see. It's part of the Iraq rocket, but it's true. That's certainly a nice smell. It's not part of the Torahs that we use here.
Smells into the taste.
Sorry?
So when it smells into the taste, it have a meaning, right?
The Hadas.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's just not part of the Torah, so it figures less than Mordechai does. Shemar HaMishkan. That integration of those two aspects is not just a remez to the nature of
It's
Torah.
20 hours.
It's a remez to the nature of my separations as a whole, which is always an integration in each instant of space-time of the possibilities that Amalek is always aware of, which is why we keep them alive for Dor Dor, because those are always the paths not taken, so to speak, which need to be kept alive in order to provide the uniqueness for that which is taken. And that's indeed what Purim is all about. The fact that Reva Batzalal Yamod Yudim B'Makom Acher is not a reason not to act. It's a reason where you absolutely must act. Because if I am the Makom Acher, then that's incredible, because then it becomes everything, right? That's what's so astonishing about it. So if you don't act, because now that you understand what this means, what do you want? You want Haman to die of a heart attack? And then no one will even know that anything happened. There won't be any Esther. There won't be any Moulin Rouge and crazy story of the Megillah. What's wrong with you? Right? The show must go on. You've got to go there. Right? So it's like a very profound interrelationship, which now becomes also the nature of the literal creation of Beis HaMikdash, not stam in terms of there being a mokum and there being kalim and there being consciousness that provides for it, but something much more profound, and that is the nature of consciousness itself is what Mordechai was talking about. Combined with Atu Beis HaVichtovedu is what we mean by consciousness. And let me explain. Because the extent of the field within which you are and the instant that is currently being electrically experienced, and the thing that you're doing and your presence in that thing is what we experience as a conscious moment, right? That's the real meaning of Zechira. Zechira doesn't mean memory. Zechira means the power of the interconnectedness of those two elements. Because of it, it becomes the only way in which it's possible to understand Ma'aseh Bereishis through the Mishkan, which we do. Because we didn't understand Shabbos until we got to the Mishkan, which is why we introduced Shabbos later in terms of the Mishkan, which is the malacha in Ma'aseh Bereishis is Meleches Machshavos. That's the point. It's the interrelationship of the possibilities of what reality can bring forth with the way that allows us to relate to it in very particularized formats. So that is expressed halachically in Meleches Machshavos. In other words, the Meleches Machshavos is not what you do or the fact of its having been done. It is not the fact that you conceived of the possibility of doing such a thing. It's the application of your awareness to what is actually being done. La halacha. So in other words, if you walk into a room and you turn on the lights on Shabbos, you haven't done anything wrong because there was no Meleches Machshavos. There's just a habit, right? And so on. So there's not even awareness of what it is that you're doing. Without awareness, there can't be a malacha, by definition. But even if there is awareness, but it's not a full awareness, it can't be a malacha. If it isn't relating your awareness to the purpose of the malacha, it's washing it tzricha. Again, it's not a real malacha. In this case, as this Furno points out, which is mamish, just absolutely beautiful, we don't only require the normal Meleches Machshavos in terms of the simple Meleches HaMishkan, But what we mean is something much more. So we say, Ve'em yikhu et hazahav. The Sforno learns that means that the actual lekicha has to be with the kavanah for the purpose. Forget about what you use it for. That means sheyichavnu be'et ha'asiyah ken yichavnu k'sheyikhu. V'ha'avanim tiyena al shmot b'nei Yisrael. What does that mean? K'sheyakdishum ha'mitnadvim yehekdesham l'shem kach sheyikatfu aleihem shemot ha'shvatim. It's like unbelievable. So every last thing has to be conscious, going all the way back to ultimately your awareness of what its purpose is. Of course, in the deeper sense, it means, as we know, and once we get to Betzalel, it means relating it all the way back to my separations and the Osyos, Shenivru B'Hem Shemayim V'Aretz, that Betzalel is capable of being Mitzarev, which takes us all the way back to the moment of Adam Rishon being still lying golem, the Gan Eden, and the Pischai, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Pesach Sifra Shel Adam, there, Dor V'Dor Shav, in which we, Hinei Karasi B'Shem Betzalel Ben Uri Ben Chur. That means it's part of the Etzem Asiyas Adam to learn as an embryo, so to speak, information, which was what the nature of information has to become. That information has to include the source of the thing, which means that if I'm taking these little trinkets to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's not just a question of taking them, it's at least recognizing in terms of physics where they come from. If I don't understand the interrelationship of forces that are Barumas and Eshesh Shemayim V'Aretz, but I can at least deal with the level of the interrelationship of forces that create fusion and that give us generations of stars that lead me to understand when a star will go novae and supernovae and what elements will be created from it and how they scatter throughout the universe to ultimately provide us with the minerals that are required and the elements that are required, which are generated nowhere else, and which only came through a history in my separations, and not through a specific creation, such that Zahav needed to be already second generation stars that would provide us with a planet that has Zahav and so on and so forth. All of that is the minimal amount of true Meleches Machshavas, in which you take it all the way back to my separations. It's not trinkets. It's part of that beged with all of its possibilities. That's the reason that we want to talk about the Avanim Tihiyed al Shmot B'nei Yisrael. And how about the Beis HaMikdash itself? Avanim. Yeah, there was an Evan, the Evan HaShasiyah. So where does the Evan HaShasiyah come from, says the Gemara in Yuma? Well, because when there was still a dust cloud around the local star, so that dust cloud had to coagulate the planets, right? Okay, so fine. So there was one slightly larger clod, which had a higher gravitational pull than the other clods. So ultimately, everything gathers around that clod, you know. So those are the regavim that Eov makes reference to. So what happened to that original clod? Oh, that was vomited up in billions of years of tectonic activity and became the Evan HaShasiyah, says the Gemara. That's Avanim Tiyena. So you want to know how much Kavanah is there for a Beis HaMikdash? Is the first tiny mathematical difference of the gravitational attraction of that Evan. That becomes now the center of the earth, which becomes our Beged center. It's, silly center of the earth of Yerushalayim. It's ridiculous, but it isn't in terms of Avanim Tiyena, right? It's like unbelievable. So that's that concept of Meleches Machshavas, but that means that this interrelationship of being able to deal with the Shemen on the one hand and the Ketores on the other hand is the interrelationship of Hinei Ma Tov U'Meno and Shevet Achim Gam Yachad, who become now the two counters, one of which is providing that vision of Netzach that becomes Reva Vatzala Yamot Udim Makom Acher, which is Keneged Amalek's nefesh that comes from Olam HaTov, Kabbalistically, because Moshe Rabbeinu is aware of all of this potential, and therefore is the only one that can truly represent Rashis. And on the other hand, this idea of the absolute uniqueness of instantiation, which is the Zikaron of Bnei Yisrael of Aaron, that interrelationship has to be capable of Yachdav. And that's, as the Gemara points out, Hine matovu manoim, shevet achim, which achim? Every achim we've ever heard of just killed each other. They hate each other. Whoever heard of shevet achim gam yachad starts going through, like, which achim? Are we talking about maybe Cain Be'evel? Yeah. Are we talking about the achim, the sons of Noah? Sure. We're talking about Yitzchak and Yishmael, maybe? Yeah. Yaakov and Esau, wonderful. Yosef and his brothers, fantastic. Just stories that make Philadelphia look silly. The brotherly love of the city, my gosh. All about brotherly love that only a Christian can believe in, right? I mean, what a bunch of crap. So this is going, so what is it referring to? What in the world we've been name? Oh, there's one case in history. Moshe V'Aaron. So that becomes Keshem and Hatov, Hayored al Zakan, Zakan Aaron, which now becomes the marker of all of the joy and happiness that everyone shares in, because it just flows, and it becomes Kital Hermon. Right? It becomes, there's a place where it gathers, but it just flows out. So it has to be absolutely beyond any capability of Kina in order to be able to create the relationship that becomes the functioning Mishkan. And that functioning Mishkan turns out, if this is the case, that then the very, and this is the interrelationship, if you think about it, it's really the interrelationship between the microcosm and the macrocosm, right? Cosm. In other words, in terms of the macrocosm, we see things clothed in all of these begotim, and things seem to have a very specific moment. None of that appears in the microcosm. All that we see are statistical, undefined realities until we sit there and give them their begotim. So this becomes now our Schrodinger box moment in terms of the universe as a whole. The Rebbe Batzalai Yamodu Yudimi Makom Acher is basically a description of a quantum level of reality. And the outer base of Ichtavedo is the collapse of the wave function. And the Miyodem Le'et Gazot is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, obviously, which I can't tell you, but I can tell you that if you don't respond Le'et Gazot, that you've destroyed everything, because that's the whole point. Because we are going to look, and you're going to be doing the looking. And that's what will make things real. So I can't tell you in advance anything, which is why, of course, she didn't think of anything in advance. That's the Gemara points out. So what was she thinking? Anything. So these were all possibilities. And plenty more. As Esther was thinking about. But that means that Esther did not only make it possible to create a Beis HaMikdash, but was herself the essence of what a Mishkan would be. Because she incorporates in herself that viability of the interrelationship of those two things. So she becomes the Reva Vatzala, and she becomes at that moment the collapse of it into La'et Hazot, and because of that creates this immense aura, the simcha, the sarsa, the yakar, which are exactly the issues that we're talking about over here. The transference of Keri into yakar, the tefillin that becomes now the Ramuz in the Arsha, the nature of simcha and the ultimate simcha, and this becomes now the kibla, which is the tikkun to the sense of not having a viable identity as a human being on Maimon Har Sinai, and even essentially as Adam HaRishon, where we still are concerned with Hanachashi Shiani, and in the end is the Makar in terms of the achievement of the Mishkan, which then now only has to take on its historical Gidim and Basar in order to become alive. So this is an amazing story. So the question is, you will ask, so what indeed does this have to do with the fundamental issues of B'nai Karuna over here? So in order to understand that, we need to go back to question the nature of primal beged. What is the nature of primal beged? So as I've pointed out to you here, the problem in the human condition is essentially expressed in two words in my separations, which leads to all of the issues of sexual obsession, of a breakdown of the relationship, of kvias teva, of the problem of Aisha Shenatata Imadi, of the war between the sexes, of the Vahuyim Shalbach, all of the issues that appear in the Megillah. Because that's what the Megillah is about. Feminism, nakedness, women, wine, song, partying, and so on and so forth, right? And essentially, Vahuyim Shalbach. And centers around begadim. Those two words are velo yitboshashu. Now that velo yitboshashu turns into the whole story of the tzniut of Esther, the question of the meaning of nakedness and how it appears in the Megillah. And as Rashi says, the most astonishing thing, at this moment, vayush ne'em eromim velo yitboshashu, which then goes into the other concept of erom, which is Va'anachashayayrum, the very next person. Which is what? I mean, but that doesn't mean naked. And then the Gemara puts the two together by saying, well, you have to be Aaron Badas the way the Nachash is, essentially, in order to be able to get somewhere in life. That becomes the marker of the Eitz Hadas, which is like, what? Like, what are those two things? How do they relate to each other? Fine. So Rashi says that, so at this point, says Rashi, it should, you're falling asleep so you can't type. All we're getting is XXXX for 16 pages. Z, oh. Oh, that's why it's Z. I was wondering. You might as well put in an icon, very cute Z icon. It's always a pleasure having you at a shir. The energy is like, wow, fantastic. So as Rashi says, the meaning of that V'lo Yitboshashu is that it should have been followed by the pasuk of HaKadosh Baruch Hu Asa La'adam and Ishto Kutanot or Vayalbishim, which appears only later. Why doesn't it appear now, says Rashi? But because since we have, point out the play on words, but since immediately we begin with the Hanachashayah, so we interrupt this story to bring you a little side effect, which has murdered billions of us and continues to do so. That little side meaning of the delay in Vayaslam Kutnot Or, which according to Rabbi Meir means Kutnot Or, an olive, which takes us back to the Or of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Siblas Or, right? Or to Or Kasama. But why? I mean, everybody's vision of Gan Eden is this primal innocence. So why in the world should HaKadosh Baruch Hu bring begadim, which are kotnot or, before anybody discovered genitals? So what is the point? I mean, and it's even unclear. How do you discover genitals? By eating. Right? I mean, the whole thing becomes this genital story of Genesis, but it doesn't really make any direct appeal to something genital. I mean, yes, the Midrashim do it. So as Rashi says, well, because they were Arabim, so the Nachash becomes like overwhelmed with desire for Chava, and that's how this whole thing takes place, which turns the Nachash into the primal phallus, which becomes the essence of rape, which is the whole reptilian mammalian argument in Gan Eden in terms of geologic time, and turns into Bris Milah, in which we take the Nachash off of the human, and the Nachash off Lachma, we stick the foreskin into Afar, and so on. I mean, like, we translate these very Freudian elements into like strange things that we do. But we don't see the Pashtas. Why in the world would innocence abroad need to be covered? So why should HaKadosh Baruch Hu be making a Kotnot Or? So the implications of those Kotnot Or is that the part of the actual creation of Adam, because this is taking place during creation, so not post-creation. That means part of the creation of Adam is clothing. This is the reason that Chazal view it as keratin, right? So we have to be so careful cutting nails and so on, because that brings back the kolos and Gan Eden, destroys pregnancies, and all these crazy things. But how could there have been, in the creation of Adam, a built-in beggar? So, what would it mean? So that means that dealing with the issue of the Veloyed Boshashu is central, as we already saw, to the most immediate experiential reaction that a Nivra would have in finding itself suddenly existing. Right? So Veloyed Boshashu is itself a sense of invulnerability. So as we spoke about, incredible medrash that points out that the Parsha of Amalek follows the Parsha of V'chzika b'mevushav. What in the world does Amalek have to do with V'chzika b'mevushav? So people in general talk about a pretty poor relationship. So this tells us about the way that Amalek used to throw penises up into the sky, but this story is not about penises, it's about testicles. So what in the world does it have to do with that remez, right? But what's amazing is that the Lo Yitbo Shashu has to do with the nature of Yechzika B'Nevushav. It's there that the Torah defines for us the nature of Busha. So we understand Lo Yitbo Shashu. So Veloy Boshashu obviously has nothing to do then with the sense of embarrassment. It has to do with the sense of vulnerability, which is what Busha is about. So the exposure of vulnerability is not embarrassment, but it's about the way that we use the word even in English until today. We say, the guy has no shame. The guy has no shame doesn't mean he's not embarrassed by anything. It means that he doesn't sense that he's vulnerable at all, that there's anything to even think about. It's, do whatever you want, as if there's nothing else but you that's there, right? So, and that's the reason that we actually twist the normal word for testicles in the Torah is ashach, like Baruch Ashach, in the list of Muni, right? We would never, ever use such a word, V'chzika b'mevushav, except in context. In context, that means that if a woman is able to tackle this 8-foot-high guy who's attacking her husband by twisting his balls, obviously she's taking advantage of vulnerability. So it's the vulnerability aspect that is the V'chzika b'mevushav, and is bringing out that concept of why this is called b'mevushav. Pointed out that the whole movie Stand By Me is based on this yesod, that sneas is expressed in terms of V'chzika b'mevushav. Amazing. Insight is just astounding. I mean, it just shows how things are so embedded in the nature of reality and psychology. It ends up always being expressed. It's unbelievable. Fine. So that means that the original problem in the human condition is how does one deal with the sense of absolute vulnerability as being here when I should not be here. So in other words, the complete surprise of existence can lead you in two directions. Either in a sense of entitlement, which is the most difficult thing for us to escape, because existence itself gives us this feeling that if I exist at this moment, I'm meant to exist in the next moment, which doesn't make any sense at all, because it's really part of the contradiction to why anything would exist at all that isn't an absolute extant being, right? This is such an incredible blank stare that you get from the West that there is no sense of surprise of existence at all, that their vision of Maaseh Bereshis in terms of Christianity is creationist, because all they can conceive of is doing things. I mean, obviously there are molecules there, and God puts them together. So if I can account for the fact that things evolve, there would be no need for God. If you can have an infinitely an infinitely lazy creator, as Richard Dawkins points out. I mean, so what do I need creation for, right? I mean, the absurdity of, aren't you forgetting something? What? That things are instead of aren't? Of course they are. I mean, because they are, right? But it's like an amazing thing. That doesn't even occur to them. So they barely have words for being. Like there's no concept. So the most fundamental aspect of Klal Yisrael, which is Avram Avinu's shock at existence and is taking everything back to, as the Rambam says, a prime being, Matzi Rishon, and the shock of how that could happen and what it implies about the nature of creation and chesed and the insanity of Avodah Zarah and secondary sources, which is essentially the rejection of artificial begotten, in which you project your entitlement onto the way nature is, and therefore create gods in your image instead of vice versa, which is the whole essence of Avram Avinu's quest. They miss out on that. And the only ones that achieved a ratius that is commensurate with that is Amalek. I take nothing for granted, right? So therefore, I am more willing to deal, that's the two ratios, the ratius Chaim Amalek versus the dream of ratius in Bria, ratius Bara Elokim. So as we said, that is the first problem. The sense that you have of, no matter how small it is, an entitlement to being and some assumption of being, and therefore a loss of shock at being, is the fundamental problem. And it in fact causes the fundamental loss of consciousness, because consciousness is always driven by the shock of existence. So if someone who doesn't have that shock cannot really be conscious, because everything fades into a background in which it's just a background, it's meant to be there. More profoundly, it destroys the nature of simcha. Because why would I be happy at existing if that's just a given? It's the shock of existing that is the ultimate happiness. So Mamela, the nature of Beged as part of what it means to be a human being is so fundamental that it's part of the creation of the human being. Because what it comes to make is the recognition that there is no naked being. There cannot be such a thing. There can only be the incredible, enclosed beged of something which has been projected onto the nature of reality and which must live with those projections. The closer one gets to a profound sense of how it is that the interrelationship of Atu Beta Vichto Vedu to Revach Vatzlar Yamod Yudim Makom Acher, the more incredible is the potential for the love of every object within that universe, such that as we become more and more aware of the absurdity of our beliefs instead of the way things just are, the more unbelievable human beings are capable of expanding their nature of connectedness. In other words, things that just 50 years ago or 100 years ago were horrors are now objects of love. Right? So I mean, people looked at killer whales as horrifying. You know, a child's nightmares, an octopus, right? I mean, it's like, literally, these are monsters. Today, like, my dream would be for an octopus to grab my hand and take it to show me its home, like happened recently, right? Wow, there's this sense of profound love. I mean, the gorilla was, oh my God, King Kong, you know, and now it's, oh my gosh, what an incredible, you know, to rescue a human child and the gorilla presents it to you and cares for it and so on. This sense of the interrelationship that extends even to life that we've never met. So it's the crazy variations of life on this planet that were originally terrifying to us. Spiders were scary and now they're pets. tarantulas were horrors, and now they're any child's bedroom. I mean, this is like insane. What dreamt such thing is possible? It's amazing. So too is any alien life form in which you could consider the fact of sentience itself as being an indication of the potentiality of the universe as a whole, can become literally a mocker of love. And you take it for granted to the point of risking your species that any sentient sufficiently developed would feel that love. So you attempt to communicate with them, right? So you send out messages from the earth. Well, you're crazy, you're calling down the aliens. So this is the original response, but as there's a greater and greater understanding, there's less and less of that concern. And I want so much to connect to something that has so much in common with me because we are children of that Rebbe Matzela Yamud Mimakom Acher. That we have to break down from Erev, then we'll get on to discuss how it is that Purim figures so heavily in all of this.